Welcome to Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance, a podcast series brought to you by Trulient Talks. I'm your host, Indy Alawalia, and I'm delighted to navigate the dynamic world of pharmacovigilance and risk management with you. But first, a quick disclaimer. The opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the individual guest and do not necessarily reflect the official views of Trulient Consulting. We're all about fostering insightful conversations here at Trulient Talks, and we want you to know that any product, vendor, or service mentioned does not imply an endorsement. If you're seeking professional advice for specific situations, we encourage you to go to our experts. Please remember, this podcast content is meant for informational and educational purposes only. So, today we are incredibly fortunate to have Fraser McCullum, the founder of Imagine Pharmacovigilance Limited, as our speaker. Fraser, welcome.
Indy, hi, how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. Thank you for coming onto the podcast today.
Oh, thanks very much for the invite. This is something that I've been quite curious to do. I've never done this before. This will be fun.
Yeah, hopefully it will be. And actually, what I want to ask you, as I think it's a question that is always a good small talk question in PV gatherings, which is, how did you get into PV?
I fell into it by accident. I desperately try not to think about how many years I've been in PV, because it's more than 20. Let's just put it like that. It's more than half my life, really. I was a bench scientist, and I got really, really bored with it. And I was pretty good at the kind of innovation, if you like, but the kind of repetitive nature of it just really, really bugged me. So I was trying to get out, and I applied to a CRO for a job as a medical writer, of all things. And they rejected me 3 times.
Wow.
And then I got a call, and I still remember I got a call on a really horrible November morning in Glasgow saying, we would like to offer you a job in drug safety. And I had absolutely no idea what it was. I was so determined to get out of the lab, I just took the job.
Yeah.
And I've never looked back. It was like the planets had aligned. And I've fallen into something that I love, and I've never looked back.
And you've had quite an interesting career through your drug safety experience. So why don't you go through that for our listeners?
Yeah. So, like I said, I'd started off in a CRO, a very small CRO that had just opened up an office in Glasgow. I'm obviously Scottish. Those kind of jobs were few and far between north of the border. So I was really lucky. It was myself and a colleague. We're both still in PV, as far as I'm aware. I haven't spoken to her in a long time. And we essentially taught ourselves case processing. She was a nurse, had about 6 weeks more experience than I did.
Wow. And
we kind of made it up as we went along. We were really lucky. We had a couple of patient clients who were quite willing to take us on and kind of teach us. And actually, one of those clients I ended up with as a job with full-time job with her in my time in AstraZeneca. So Vicky Edwards quite kindly offered me a position, and that was a lot of fun as well. So after about maybe 3 or 4 years in CRO, I went to AZ. They were looking to set up a case processing unit in their UK affiliate, and obviously having essentially done that in Glasgow, because we built it from the ground up. Mm-hmm. I went and did that, and I was there for another 3.5 years. Having come from a kind of service provider background, I could see what felt like the writing on the wall from a case processing perspective, because there was a big move. This was just as the industry was moving to outsourcing the case processing from, traditionally it had all been done in-house. Mm-hmm. And I thought, well, maybe better go and do something else. So I went and did some signal detection, signal management at Gilead for a while, and that was a lot of fun. I learned so much from the other side, as a consumer of the information that I used to provide.
Yeah.
I think you learn an awful lot from that, kind of having that different view of the world. And that's really where I started to think about how we can maybe do things differently. The whole background to that was, in those days, quite often things would come in paper. You'd literally get a letter, or maybe you'd get it in a fax machine, literally a fax machine. Now you don't have fax really these days, because everything comes in as an e-fax. But even if it is faxed, it's still quite relatively infrequent. So all of this kind of information was coming in paper, and you would sit and you'd type it in, and then you'd analyze it, obviously, and report it. And even then, you would print out the COMs, and you would send it in. And we used to courier it into MHRA.
Yeah.
Like every day there would be a courier turn up. We'd give them the pile of paper, and off he would go. E2B was still a bit of a dream. It was just starting to come out, I think, but it was still a bit of a dream because the technology behind that really wasn't keeping up, I don't think. And we can talk about where that's taken us, I think, maybe as we go along. After Gilead, I went to Roche, and I was there for a long time. I had a lot of fun in Roche. It was hard work. There was lots of things going wrong, or problems that needed fixed, maybe was the better way to put it. But that's what I love doing, is fixing problems and thinking of solutions to ways of doing stuff. So I was there for 14, 15 years. And then I decided that it was time to go independent, and I set up Imagine Pharmacovigilance, and I've been doing this for about 2 or 3 years now.
And you're enjoying it still? You still love the PV?
I still love PV. I much prefer PV to actually doing any kind of business development. I'm a really terrible salesman. There's a reason why I do PV, put it that way. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. I've had to look at the world and again in a different way, coming at it as a consultant and trying to help shape other people's thinking a little bit so that they can get the outcome that they're looking for. So it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun, and I've met so many great people.
So one of the things you were touching upon was, you started off doing case processing, and then you saw the writing on the wall with regards to case processing being outsourced. One of the things that I think about in my career is that I started off as a case processor. I don't have a science degree, so I came in with a law degree, started doing, data entry, working my way through, and then there was obviously a ceiling. Once you don't have a science degree, there was kind of a ceiling that you couldn't really go much further. With the rise of this new technology, the AI, and the fact that outsourcing is quite prevalent within our industry, specifically for the sort of the more basic jobs, I always thought that outsourcing was cyclical. Sometimes it would go off, and then sometimes it will come back in, and to me, it always seemed cyclical. But I think the nail is fully being hammered in right now. That it is kind of the death of the sort of basic data entry into PV, and that makes me think about what is the new way for people to step into PV. So a person like me, for instance, who had no idea about PV, and yourself, you kind of have these stories around the world of people just suddenly being in PV.
Yeah. I think probably a lot of people, certainly my age, that's the path, is they just kind of fall into it, because it wasn't really a discipline. And I still remember my medical director at the time saying, "You're coming in at the right time, because this will just grow and grow and grow." At the time, I think ICH E2A had just been ratified, so it was still being implemented, and there was a whole pile of change, and people were still working their way through it. So there has been a huge amount of change as we've gone through the kind of 20 odd, pushing 30 years that I've been doing this. The way in, I think, it probably there are still multiple ways into this. If you think about it, so case processing is still a legitimate way of doing it. It's a different path, I think, and I'll come back to that in a second. But if you think about it, medical writing, which was where I thought my path would be, there's a whole industry around writing periodic reports. These are really complex documents that require not just good, writing skills, but you need to be able to understand and manage the various stakeholders that are involved in producing this thing. You've got the medics, you've got the clinicians, a whole pile of people across the industry trying to pull together a story. That's what it is. It's trying to tell a story. And that is still, I think, a legitimate way in to PV. You've then obviously got the kind of safety surveillance side of things, big data, epidemiology. All of this is still there. And I think it will change. It probably has changed. I'm not an epidemiologist, so I can't really comment. But I think it can and will change, but it's still a legitimate way in. It depends on what interests you. I mean, I think with hindsight, I'm probably call myself a data junkie. That's what I like. I take great pride. I still take great pride in seeing a good, well-documented report, because you can gain insight from that. Maybe not at an individual report level, but on an aggregate, if they're really well documented, it makes life downstream an awful lot easier. And I've seen that from my side of things. So to come back to case processing, because that's my bread and butter, that's what I've always done. Like I mentioned, that it used to be it would come in on letters or on faxes, emails. Just it would happen, but it wasn't great. You didn't have all of these really clever CRM systems that you have to trawl through these days, and you were essentially shuffling paper around. I still remember having banks of case files.
Yeah.
Case files, which no longer exist.
Yeah.
And I think the way that I look at, you mentioned AI, and I think that's probably the hot topic, really. You mentioned AI. The way I look at it, it's not that it's taking people out of case processing or anywhere else in PV. It's changing the way that people do that. And I still think there is a role for people in that. It moves the process along. So it's no longer a data entry process. It's an exceptions-based decision-making process. And I think that, if you think about it like that, it opens up a whole different way of thinking about it, but a different opportunity for people. And I think it's a lot of fun. I think it could be a lot of fun. There are huge implications and still some really meaty problems that still need to be ironed out. That's the reason why we don't really have a fully AI-based system yet. People claim that it is, but I don't think it really is. And it's not through want of trying. I think it's a difficult thing to do. And just a word on AI, because this is a tangent we probably don't want to go down, but I think there's a huge misconception about what AI is.
Correct.
And it's fed by media, the traditional media outlets, talking about the end of the world, which it may bring about the end of the world. That's a different conversation. Let's not go there. But you've also got like all of these movies from way back from the Terminator to to the Marvel movies, all of this kind of stuff, which is basically saying that AI is bad because it makes a good story. You need a bad guy, and why not make it an AI system? And I think that warps people's perceptions about what it actually means. Let's not necessarily go down that route, but it's just a word of warning that it's not as simple as that. Doesn't have the ability to replace humans, not yet, and maybe not ever.
And that's a really good point. I think one of the things I was just thinking about was PV is notoriously skeptical about any new technology, whether it be simple rules-based systems, which could actually help them to make their processes a lot easier, or even the move from fax to e-fax. When I started my career, I remember that there was a fax machine, and we were getting CIOMs from our partner in Brazil. And I remember when we moved to e-fax, it was such a big deal. And but I remember at the time thinking, well, my phone can play clips on YouTube. Like, surely we should have moved to this before.
And that's exactly why I tried to move into this arena, really, is I could not believe that I was still doing, 20 years later, still doing essentially the same job as I had been, when in my hand I had, crazy tech. I mean, my phone is, if you showed that to my grandparents who are passed away, it would be like magic to them. And we take it for granted. And there are technologies out there that I think if you adapted and adopted correctly would completely transform PV, and move us away from this kind of view that you have to enter data into a database. There are ways that you don't have to do that. You mentioned sort of simple robotic automation, and that's been around for years in PV. But the adoption of this, it takes a lot of effort, because we are, as an industry, very conservative and reticent to take on this thing, because I think there's a level of fear, which I think is multifactorial. But because of the regulators, I think that's one factor. The regulators are, people don't want to be seen to, they don't want to get it wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And adopting technology at the cutting edge in such a heavily regulated environment comes with risk. And I think for a lot of people, that risk is not appropriate, maybe, or they don't want to take it. I think that's something that we need to look at and to tackle. But then there's the thing about, well, it's going to take my job. So at a personal level, people are thinking about it's going to take my job, which it may do. But if you think about it differently, is if you adapt the way that you work, you can grow with the new technology as opposed to being replaced by it. And that's the kind of the thought process that I went through. Is, I won't necessarily be typing data into database anymore, but I will be interacting with the data and making decisions that an AI system can. So it's about working together, and that brings up, that opens up a whole different conversation around technology and data science and all the rest of it, which, I don't have the answers to all of it. I've got an opinion, but I don't have the answers.
And actually, thinking about that a little bit further, you're mentioning data science, and in the past, we're going to be kind, in the past 20 years of your career, the whole shape of a PV department has completely changed, right?
Yeah.
Again, when I started off, we were doing case processing in-house, so the case processing team was rather large. We'd have safety scientists, we'd have medics, and that was kind of the main crux of a PV department. But now we have you were talking about safety surveillance, data analysts. I mean, it's a changing face of an actual PV department.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started my career, the volume of people, if you looked at the totality of a PV department, more than half of it was probably case process, because it was brute force data entry. You're right. There was medics, but a lot of that was reviewing cases as opposed to reviewing signals necessarily. The whole quantitative signal detection piece was really just still as I remember it being born, if you like. Despite my youthful good looks.
You'll always be young to me, Fraser. Always be young.
Age's a number. And it has moved. And I think, sometimes people notice the technology moving with it. Sometimes they don't. And sometimes actually that has the move has been come through the technology, or sometimes the technology's had to catch up with the changing requirements from the regulators, the process, however you want to look at it. And much more now, I think you've got this tension, dichotomy, however you want to put it, between the kind of PV department, the IT department, and then now it's starting to come into a more sort of data science, data engineering question, as people are looking at these big data sets and trying to glean insight from that. And it's everybody's, I don't think it's well managed personally, not always anyway. I think too many people are thinking about it as their baby, or this is my department, without thinking about it at a much higher level and thinking, well, what's the outcome that we're trying to get here? Is there a way that we can work together to make it better?
And that is the question. What is the outcome?
What is the outcome? It has to be at a patient level or a population level. The kind of end user, if you like, is ultimately a patient. And what the science of PV is trying to do is to protect them, to make sure that they have the right information to make the right decisions around the medications and the treatments that they're getting. Ultimately, that's what it is. Next level down, you've got this kind of tension between the regulators and the industry, because the regulators are there to make sure that that the industry is doing what it needs to do to have that outcome. That's why you have things like, PV systems, the GVP modules in Europe or the equivalent elsewhere in the world, databases, information. It's all coming about to drive that. And that's where the inspections are coming from, is to make sure that the industry is compliant with all of the legislation that goes around that. It's arguably the most heavily regulated part of daily life. Really, it feels like it's the most heavily regulated, being in the middle of it. So that's the outcome that I think we're trying to get to. And I think if you try and keep that in mind, it makes some of the decisions and some of the paths that you want to take become clearer, I think, as opposed to the traditional piece, taking it from the beginning of the process, which is processing data and then working up. It's better to start with what's the outcome and work back and see where the two meet.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And you bring up regulatory agencies. Do you think? Trying not to be too controversial here. Do you think that the fact that regulatory agencies are not so involved in industry Do you think that they are actually in a bubble and don't understand the complexities of being in business in pharmacovigilance?
I'm going to sit on the fence a little bit. I think yes and no. I think there are certainly aspects of the day-to-day operation at an industry level that that the regulators don't understand. I remember sitting in front of a regulator. I will name no names or no countries involved, and I was talking about submission rules, which from from an industry perspective, it's common parlance. We all understand there's a set of rules configured in the database that enable submission, because when you're sending out literally millions of submissions every year, you can't do that manually because you would run out of people. So you use your rules to help manage that for you. And this gentleman looked at me and was like, "What do you mean submission rules?" And he just had no concept of what that was. I mean, this was many years ago, so it may have changed now. This is I'm going back at least 10 years. And that was like a revelation. This is the guy, one of the people who sets the regulations, didn't understand the impact of what they were doing. I think it's probably changed a little bit, but I think you can still see some of that. And there is this dichotomy between those that set the rules and those that follow them, because it's difficult. And when you multiply that by how many countries, 200 odd countries around the world, each of them having slightly different requirements, trying to make that work. Well, A, it's a nightmare, but B, it keeps me in a job. So, it's helpful, I think, to some extent. I think, unfortunately, the kind of move towards harmonization that I mentioned ICH E2A, that kind of move towards harmonization, you don't really see that coming around quite the same way. Even talking about E2B, which everybody talks about E2B, even the individual files that get fired around the ether, they're all slightly different.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, it's where's the balance? And I don't know that the industry and regulators have got the balance right. And trying to manage that's difficult, and that's where technology could really help, I think.
So that's an interesting question. We're talking about how technology could help. We have several companies. In fact, I would say in the recent couple of years, there's been multiple companies suddenly coming out of woodworks thinking that they know and understand PV the best, and they're able to create a system that would ultimately be able to be the savior of PV. But there's this move to SaaS, software as a service, which is very different to how traditionally we have bought software. We as a PV group of people have gone to vendors and said, "Well, we need a system to do this. Build me a system to do this. It's not quite right, so we want you to make changes here, here, and here." With the move to SaaS and cloud-based systems, where essentially the vendor becomes the owner of what is designed in that software, is there a question that regulators need to be looking at software vendors? I realize this is very controversial, but is there a need for regulators to start looking at software providers, because you're a customer of these software vendors, and they're saying this is the way that you should report to this particular place, and if they cannot update the software in time to make any quick changes, whose fault is it that has not gone to the right place at the right time?
It's a huge question. It's a huge question. I think So let me maybe replay a little bit
Absolutely.
of a background, if you like. So I think the short answer is yes, there is a need. I think that there is a likelihood that it will happen. And the reason I say that is when you look at regulatory inspections, it used to be done solely on the pharma company. I think more and more you see instances where the service providers, the case processing, if you like, the service providers that the pharma industry are using are being inspected to make sure that they are doing the right thing. Just probably the easiest way to describe it. And that's happening either through the inspection of the client or directly with the service provider itself. And I think you'll see that happening again, but this time it will be with the tech providers as opposed to the service providers. So you will get inspection of the tech companies either through, I think initially probably through the pharma company itself. And eventually I think it will come that they will actually inspect the tech providers, and they're going to have to work that through. Because you're right, they are providing a service to multiple clients, and they're not always getting it right. And the clients are left holding that particular baby, trying to work out how to become compliant. And I think the short answer is I think it will come. Indeed, it isn't already happening, because a lot of the, I've been involved in negotiating a few contracts around this kind of SaaS provider, and I was very clear that we needed to get the provider on the hook to provide support, because it's their system that we are using. And if we don't have the ability to poke about in it the way that we would have done had it been a homegrown or an on-prem solution, we need to get their support to do that. And there's a whole pile of service level agreements and disaster recovery and all of that kind of stuff that you need to then think about to make sure that you have that. And that's an expectation of the regulator. So you're either going to go direct to the tech company provider or through the pharma company to get to that information. So it'll happen one way or another. It's an interesting question around their ability to flex to the regulations. And I think you and I, without naming names, I'm not going to cause any problems. But I think there are some of the companies out there are not great at responding or understanding even the nuance that different health authorities have. You can't just have a blanket approach. Everybody talks about, let's send an E2B file. Yeah, well, that's fine. But who to and on which profile? There's a whole pile of stuff in there that I think gets lost when you just think about an E2B file. There is no such thing as one E2B file, really. And I think until you really get that understanding in the tech companies, you're not going to be able to have that kind of real end-to-end service, if you like.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I've obviously worked for a few tech companies, but my thought has always been the same, which is, I think a lot of providers, especially the newer providers, are looking at the PV problem, in quotation marks, as it's just a workflow. You get information in, you transform the data, and you send it out. And I think that's the way that tech companies look at it. But there's nuances for all of that.
Yeah. I think you're right, and I think there are some of the newer players have looked at this and seen exactly what you described. It's ingestion, it's processing, it's egress, essentially, in, process, out, and it's a workflow. And it's at its simplest level, that's all it is. The problem is that it's never that simple, because I tried to work this out once, and I got to a number that was really, really horrible. If you look at all of the different methods of ingestion, so at the time, you've spoken about it, you've got voice, you've got video now. I had, a couple of weeks ago, I had a TikTok with an adverse event report on it. I didn't know, we had to work out what enough to do with that. I'll come back to TikTok in a minute, because that's an interesting story. It's something that we need to think about. So you've got voice, you've got video, you've got paper, you've got email, you've got fax, you've got all sorts of things, ways that the information can come in. You've got all different people that can send it: regulatory authorities, patients, healthcare providers, service providers. At any point, this can all fall apart, and you've got to be able to manage all of that. Then when you get it, you've got all of these different systems. So there's usually an email system, there's usually the database, there's usually other feeder systems that provide information, dictionary management, all of that kind of stuff. Any one of those things can fall apart. You've then got all of the people that are processing this. So large company, Roche, AstraZeneca, Novartis, all these, and yet there's hundreds of people, maybe thousands of people, I don't know, processing all of this data. At any one point, they can make a mistake. Then you get submission rules on the back end that try and manage this information, send it to the right authority or the right recipient. And if you multiply that all together, you get a really, really horrible number about the number of places it can go wrong. The fact that we can get anything out the door is a miracle. If you think about it.
Yeah.
It's only because the people that do it understand how that all fits together. And I think the more traditional tech companies, Argus, they've got the experience to at least understand that. They might not be able to fix it. They might not be able to do anything about it. There's problems there as well. But the newer guys haven't got that experience yet, even though they've maybe stolen some of the kind of staff, if you like, from the traditional guys, trying to pull all of that together. And there are multiple examples where they've just not been able to do it. I think it will come. It has to come. Because at some point we are going to run out of service provider personnel. Because the data volumes just keep going through the roof. So it will come, but it's not there yet, I don't think. And I think trying to look at it as at that simple ingestion, processing, submission workflow is missing a lot of the nuance that we traditionally deal with manually. And you need to unpick all of those little bits separately, because each one has a separate solution from an automation perspective. And I think I'm rambling now. I'm maybe getting right into my stride. The one that's probably closest to being correct, or from a technology perspective, is closest to being solved, is probably the submissions piece on the back end, because it's rules based. The regulations say if this, do that.
Yeah,
that's relatively simple to do as a rule. Whereas getting to that point can be quite difficult, because the information is junk a lot of the time.
And that's it. I think newer providers specifically, I think they look at it as, oh, there's information here, but because they don't understand the information, they don't realize it's junk.
Yeah.
Talking about data volumes, COVID did a lot to help PV, I guess.
Depends what company you're in.
That's true, but I was talking to another guest, and they mentioned the fact that it was free publicity for adverse events reporting, and I was like, I never really thought of it like that, but absolutely, you could go into a conversation with someone and say, I work in drug safety, and they immediately understood what I was talking about for once.
Yeah, I had very similar experiences. I'm sure anybody in PV probably has, because it was everywhere, and everybody was concerned about safety profiles and reporting adverse events. I reported an adverse event.
Wow.
It's very unusual for me to do that. Thankfully, it not that bad, but yeah, the number of people that sent reports in was just astronomical, because we are taught to watch out for these kind of events where it's essentially stimulated reporting. And this is probably the big example of stimulated reporting you'll ever see, because we treated billions of people as an industry in a very short space of time, and it was everywhere, because that for 2 years, that's all we talked about was COVID.
Yeah, I it's staggering to me that the sudden switch around. I mean, COVID itself, the pandemic was, there was a lot to say about that, but from a drug safety perspective, it was, oh wow, we're front page. I don't think I ever imagined PV to be front page, and people having to the companies themselves, the pharmaceutical companies, the biotech companies, rolling out PV personnel to explain PV to people was quite incredible.
Yeah, it was. I mean, as an interested bystander, I was quite happy not to be in a vaccines company or a COVID vaccines company at the time. As an interested bystander, it was amazing to watch the way that it kind of played out, and being able to help my friends and family understand what's actually being said, taking away all of the kind of emotion and hype, if you like, around a lot of this. When this was, trying to explain why seeing some adverse events after several million doses had been sent out was not actually surprising and not really a problem, and basically being an advocate to go and get a vaccine. Unofficially it felt great, because I was able to put the perspective in it from a PV perspective. It was a fascinating time. I do think that had we been able to have the technology that I dream about available at the time, it might have made life a lot easier for the poor people who are actually processing these millions upon millions of adverse event reports. I've been at the sharp end of stimulated reporting many years ago, and it's tough. It's tough. And that's the reason that I no longer read the Daily Mail or any enough said about that.
So this podcast is called Innovation and the Future of Pharmacovigilance. So I want to ask you, without AI, let's avoid AI for a second.
Okay.
Where are we going to next? Where's the next thing? I mean, COVID was an unexpected sort of big bang, but what has that taught us, and where do we now go from an innovation and generally the future of pharmacovigilance? One of the things that you'd said earlier was, whose baby is it, with regards to PV in itself? So.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one. And I don't think you can avoid the AI topic, to be perfectly honest. I think it's one of these things that it's there, and it may be still a little bit of hype, but it is coming. I think it's unavoidable. Whose baby is it? From a company perspective, I think it's the company's baby. Unfortunately, I think because you've got these three groups of individuals or groups within an organisation that are maybe not as connected as they could be, everybody's got their own opinion on it. I come from a PV department. I am biased. I'm just going to say that right out there. We understand the data, we understand the process and the regulation much more than anybody else. But we cannot do it in isolation because we don't have the skill set. Like I said, my PhD's in molecular pharmacology. I'm a biochemist at heart, really. I work with a whole pile of people, nurses, doctors, other scientists. It's a very science-based, life science-based discipline. And yes, we do understand data, and there's loads of examples out there of people who kind of cross over between that kind of life science, medical science into data science. There's a few. I know a few people. I'm sure you do as well, Indy. That kind of make that leap, but they're few and far between. And there are other people, perhaps, who come into PV via the tech piece, but they are relatively few and far between that actually been able to bridge that gap, and because it's a different discipline, it's technology, it's not life science. And I think everybody has their own view of how things need to work. And I think the only way that you can do it is if you do it as a team. And I have seen plenty of examples where that's kind of worked well, and examples where it's not worked so well and it's kind of failed a little bit, because the technology people see it as well. It's a technology problem. And to an extent it is, because they're the ones that manage the boxes that the servers sit on. They were the ones that manage, coming back to the SaaS piece, they're the one that manage the SaaS service provider. But at the end of the day, even without AI, that technology is doing PV work. And the only people that really understand it are the PV people. So trying to do it in isolation is a disaster, and not listening to what PV needs, and trying to force. And again, there are examples in my experience where companies have been forced to take one solution over another, and it doesn't actually meet the requirements that PV have got. And I'm not talking necessarily about big projects or big solutions. It's about trying to do what's cheapest. And therefore you have to plug the gap with people and process. And what looks like cheap isn't actually cheap, because you're just moving the cost from one department to another. And I think only by looking at it as a holistic problem do you actually get the biggest bang for your buck. I had an old boss, Andy, if you're listening, thank you. I'm going to steal a quote from you from many years ago, and it's lived with me forever. And it was essentially a presentation that he did, and it had a little equation on it, and it was new system plus old process equals very expensive old process. And I think that, for me, kind of shapes the whole argument. Is you have to do it together. You have to look at the whole thing. Otherwise, you're just going to blow money that you don't necessarily need. And at the end of the day, we're a cost. We don't sell medicines, really. You could argue maybe we do, but at a discipline level, we don't bring in revenue necessarily. That's other people's job. That's the people who sell the product. So, we do have to be careful about the amount of money that we spend and being wise about it. That doesn't necessarily mean that being cheap about it is the right thing to do either. There are systems out there which are relatively cheap, but the amount of effort to make them work is astronomical.
Mm-hmm.
And you can only get so far by outsourcing, which is where the AI thing comes in for me. I think it's expensive technology, but it's just outsourcing in a different way. And therefore you can get, if you look at the holistic piece, you can get more bang for your buck if you look at it in that way of thinking, if you like. So it doesn't become, it becomes, like I say, a much more a team-based outcome rather than an individual department coming at it. So did that make any sense? That sounded like a rant.
Fraser, you never rant.
You don't know me well enough then.
Fraser, thank you very much for joining me today. It's been absolutely fantastic having you here. I've really enjoyed our talk. And I hope to speak to you again soon.
Likewise, Indy. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for allowing me to rant.
Maybe we should start your own podcast, Angry PV or something.
Grum PV, yeah.
Grum PV, excellent. Well, thank you very much.